And now, ladies and gentlemen, we're moving on to our inaugural session. As you know, India has been known globally as an independent-minded polity, and that's quite clearly been reiterated in the past year. As India utilizes its internal strengths, it is also very much expanding its global influence. Our first session focuses on India and the world. Our guest for this session is the British politician who has observed India from a global lens for several years now. She stepped in as Britain's Prime Minister when the country was undergoing turbulent times on so many fronts. With her years of experience as a leader in a multicultural and developed country, there's clearly much to learn from her about how India can shine on a global stage. It's my great pleasure to invite on stage Liz Truss, parliamentarian and the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, to deliver the keynote address. Good morning, ma'am. Welcome.
Good morning. It's fantastic to be here in Mumbai. I first traveled to Mumbai back in the 1990s when I worked for Shell in the liquid natural gas industry, which is now a very fashionable industry. And I remember on my first visit being struck by the energy and the excitement of the city. But what I have seen every time I've visited since is more energy, more excitement, and more momentum. And just in the last few days being here, seeing the hoardings getting ready for the G20, seeing the cranes, seeing the new infrastructure being built, is very clear that this city and this country has huge momentum. In June this year, India will become the largest country in the world by population. And you have rates of economic growth that I can say we envy in Western Europe. And those benefits aren't just felt in India, they're felt right across the world. In the UK, India is the second largest investor into the corporate sector in Britain. Indian companies are active in sectors from steel to technology to pharmaceuticals. But what I think is so important now, at this critical juncture for the world, is India's voice on the world stage. Because as a country that believes in freedom, that believes in democracy, and believes in self-determination, you are going to be vital in the next few years. Because the reality is that the free world is in danger. Compared to 30 years ago, a smaller proportion of the global population is living in a democracy. We've seen the rise of authoritarian regimes across the world. And we're seeing the free world, particularly in the West, facing low growth rates following the financial crisis and following COVID. This is the time when we need new voices speaking out for democracy and speaking out for freedom. The reality is that in the West we've been complacent. Since the end of the Cold War, we all thought it would be the end of history, that somehow we could take freedom for granted, that we could encourage countries to be more free enterprise, and as a result, personal freedom and democracy would follow. We became dependent on Russian oil and gas. We allowed China to join the World Trade Organization, and it's still designated as a developing country. And what we did is we enabled those regimes in some of the malign activities that have since taken place. Now, today I stand before you 1 year on from when the war in Ukraine started. And I remember it very well, because I was woken up at 3:30 in the morning by my private secretary telling me that there'd been a full-scale assault on Kyiv, on cities across Ukraine, both by air and by land. this was the first full-scale war we would see in Europe for decades. Now, we responded very quickly. We put in place severe sanctions. Britain led the way. We were the first European country to supply weapons to Ukraine. And we did all we could to try and stop the invasion happening because we had very good intelligence that it was going to take place. But the reality is we should have acted earlier. We should have allowed Ukraine to join NATO when they asked to. We should have made sure we weren't dependent on Russia for oil and gas and the finance that flowed in to Europe from Russian oligarchs. And we're now in a position where we're helping the Ukrainians, but they are the people fighting for freedom and democracy on the front line. They are the people facing the huge human cost of the atrocities that are taking place in their everyday lives. And my message today is we need to learn the lessons of this war. We need to learn the lesson that we can't take freedom for granted, that you have to fight for freedom, that you have to make the case for freedom, and you have to be prepared to defend freedom. And that's what I want to talk about today, about how India is going to play a crucial role in the next few years, because I really believe that these years will be crucial as to whether we end up in a world where authoritarian regimes have the upper hand, where they're the people making the decisions, they're the people dictating the future direction of the world, or whether we see democracy and freedom prevail. And the reason that we believe in freedom and democracy in this room is we know it is the best for human life, for our societies. We know that when we give people opportunities, when we allow people to start their own businesses, when we get people into work, when they are able to express themselves, we know that generates the ideas, the opportunities, the creativity that leads to growth and leads to opportunity. And that's what we've seen in our societies. So what do we need to do? What does India need to do? Well, first of all, we need to make the case. We need to mount a fight back against those authoritarian regimes and state capitalism who have been dominating the debate. Secondly, we need to make sure that we're working much more closely together economically. And thirdly, we need to up our levels of security and make sure we're collaborating on security. And this is something that I pursued as Foreign Secretary and as Prime Minister with India. But we need to deepen those relationships, and we also need to extend it to others who want to defend the cause of freedom. So on the economy, we need to make sure that pounds and rupees are being used in the service of freedom and democracy. They're not being used to subsidize coercion and autocracy. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to start at home. We need to make sure we show that democracy and freedom is delivering for people in our countries. And what does that mean? It means that they see their incomes rising year on year. It means that they can aspire to new opportunities, a new home, a new car. They can have the opportunities they see others around the world having. That is vitally, vitally important. And what I see in India is I see new infrastructure being built, I see new industries being developed, I see new investment going in, and those high growth rates being achieved. And that's also what we need to do in countries like the UK. The fact is, since the financial crisis, we've had relatively low growth. And what that leads to is people start to question the system. They start to say, well, in this country over here, I see there are more opportunities. What's wrong with what's happening here? So that is why it is incumbent on us as democratic politicians to give people those opportunities, give people that economic growth. And for us in Britain, that means taking on vested interests who want to stop that. What I've labeled as the anti-growth coalition. The people who say, we're all right, Jack, things are comfortable here, we don't necessarily want to see new buildings, we don't necessarily want to see our lives disturbed. but we have to change in order to be able to grow. And I think that's something that we can learn from India. That's something that we can develop. But we also need to be on the front foot about freedom and democracy. Our adversaries, like China and Russia, are very good at promoting their economic model. They use misinformation, they use technology to communicate in all kinds of ways to the world. They also use the power of economic coercion to try and influence the way people think. So we've got to stop apologizing for the way our societies work and instead start explaining why they're successful. And this is where I think India's voice is going to be incredibly important, showing that the free democracy, the world's largest democracy, the world's largest country, can deliver in a much better way than the way authoritarian regimes seek to control and coerce people. But I don't think any country can do this alone, and we need to act collectively. That's why I'm a great supporter of trading more with our allies like India. And when I was Trade Secretary, I kicked off the free trade negotiations with India. I still think this is a massive opportunity for both our countries. We've got so much in common in areas like technology, in areas like pharmaceuticals, in areas like transport, that we can work much more closely together and create a free flow of goods and services between our countries. But I also think we need to build on that. The UK is currently also negotiating accession to the CPTPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Trade Area. I would love to see in due course India join that trade area so that we are sharing ideas, sharing opportunities with people that share our values and believe in following the rules-based system. I also want to see us work together with like-minded countries to create what I describe as an economic NATO. So what we see is we see authoritarian regimes working together. Xi and Putin have declared themselves best of friends, and they are backing each other up. They're backing each other up in terms of what message they're putting out to the rest of the world. And we, on the side of freedom and democracy, need to back each other up too. And that means working together on trade more closely. It means working together on investment. We know that the Belt and Road Initiative has led lots of countries in debt and lots of countries influenced by China to do things in different ways, to vote in different ways at the UN. We need an alternative that's underpinned by freedom and democracy. And we also need to make sure that we're working together on critical minerals and supply chains. Now, during the height of the COVID crisis, I worked very closely with the Indian government on some key supplies like medicines. And what we always discovered, and I discovered this with many other countries, is we didn't always know where the supply chain finished. And quite often, it would finish with somebody or a country that we couldn't trust. Now, in the UK, we've taken action. We've removed Huawei from our telecoms networks. We've now divested ourselves of getting oil and gas from Russia. But what I would like to see is I'd like to see free democracies work together so that we are together deciding what kind of technology is it right to export to an autocratic regime where it could be used to undermine freedom and democracy. Who do we offer the deepest trade deals to? Is it a country that we trust, or is it a country that we don't trust? When we're investing in green energy like solar panels, where are we getting those solar panels from? How are they being produced? These are all questions we need to answer. We need to be conscious that those economic decisions we make will affect the future of freedom and democracy. Because what we've seen is we've seen authoritarian regimes use that economic coercion against us. So we need to use it in the service of freedom and democracy. And we need to get on with it. I would love to see the India-UK trade deal finished as soon as possible. I want to see our accession to, there's some fans in the audience of that. I would like to see us complete the CPTPP accession as soon as possible, because the next few years are going to be absolutely crucial for our security and for our democracy. And of course, economic clout is vitally important. And India's economic clout has grown significantly, will grow much more in the coming years. But that economic clout does need to be backed by hard security, because what we saw in the Russia-Ukraine situation is even a country which was not apparently very economically successful has been able to create huge misery and attack a free, democratic neighbour in Europe. And what we know is no one is immune from that around the world. No free democracy is automatically safe. We need to make sure it's safe. And what that is going to take is much more close working on security. And of course, India is a vital security partner for the United Kingdom, but also for our allies around the world. The last time I visited Mumbai was at the end of 2021. And I went out to the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier and watched the F-35s take off from the carrier, which is a fantastic sight. And in fact, the F-35s are based in my constituency in Norfolk, in England. So I actually met some local pilots from Norfolk in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It was a great experience. But what was particularly good was to see that we were conducting joint military exercises with the Indian Armed Forces. And that is what we need to be doing more of. We need closer collaboration in areas like intelligence, in defense, and in defense production, because what we know as a result of the war in Ukraine is that we need to build up our stockpiles, we need to be manufacturing more, and of course India is in an ideal position to be doing more of that manufacturing of defense equipment. So we have a real opportunity for that closer collaboration. I also believe that India has a very important role to play in the Indo-Pacific Quad. People kept asking me whether the UK wanted to join the Indo-Pacific Quad. I said I didn't think we were yet ready to move to the Pacific, but I fully support the grouping of the United States, Japan, Australia and India. I think that is going to be vitally important for protecting freedom of navigation in the Pacific, and I would like to see that develop into a more formal alliance so that we make sure democracy is protected. Because what we've learnt from the war in Ukraine is that if an authoritarian regime feels that there isn't going to be a reaction, then they will act. And we know that President Xi has said that he wants to create one China, that he wants to see Taiwan under Chinese control. I think that would be disastrous. I think that would have implications not just for Taiwan, another free democracy that we simply do not want to see extinguished, but it would also have real implications for the ability for freedom of navigation, for trade, and for security in the Indo-Pacific area. Of course, we need to develop our links with Taiwan economically. That's something that we're doing in the United Kingdom, and we want to see allies do that as well. But we also need to make sure that Taiwan's able to defend itself, because prevention is better than cure. And stepping up our economic efforts to coordinate is going to be very important at this stage before it's too late. And one of my main messages to people here today is we learnt the hard way what not preparing looks like with the war in Ukraine. Of course, Putin is responsible for that war. He's the perpetrator. But we all know in Western Europe that we should have done more earlier. Let's learn that lesson for Taiwan. Let's make sure that Taiwan's able to defend itself. And let's make sure that we've built up that economic resilience so that China cannot use economic coercion to achieve the objectives that they either achieve militarily or by that coercion. Finally, I wanted to say that there's a lot of gloomy talk at the moment, and we heard that earlier, that the world has suffered some really severe, the COVID crisis, the war in Ukraine. Sometimes it feels like things are not getting any better, that society or that the concept of freedom and democracy is not on the upward rise, it's in the decline. But I refuse to accept that gloomy talk. And I think in India, we see the greatest hope for our future, or virtually anywhere in the world. A free democracy that is growing rapidly. A country of pluralism, a country where free speech, the ability to get things done, is improving all the time. And what I want to do today, and I have been doing in my visit to India so far, is I want to encourage India to do even more. This is not just about India's future, which I believe is very positive. This is about the world's future. And if we take action now, to, whether it's improving our supply chains, improving our defense links, working together more closely to counter disinformation, that work is going to pay huge dividends in the future. And what we need to do is use the dynamism of this country, use the opportunities this country is creating to really deliver, not just for India, but for freedom and democracy, and ultimately for the whole world. Thank you.